I'm James Lee Hernandez, one of the co-authors of Mcmillions, the book.
And I'm Brian Lazarte, also the co-author of Mcmillions, which I have the book in front of me so I can do the full title. The absolutely true story of how an unlikely pair of FBI agents brought down the most supersized fraud in fast food history.
The way I discovered this was late one night, as I do, like if I can't sleep, I was just cruising through Reddit on my phone. And, in between funny cat videos and weird random things, one of the things was a TIL. Today I learned nobody really won the McDonald's Monopoly game. And so I, like most kids who grew up in the 80s and 90s, was obsessed with that game. And I needed to know more. I'm an ultra inquisitive person by nature. So I was like, I need to know everything. I need the book. There's got to be a documentary. How have I never heard of this before? And I tapped the link, and it was just this small Jacksonville newspaper blurb from back during that time in 2001. And there was nothing else on it. So I just went down the rabbit hole of like trying to Google as much as humanly possible to figure all this stuff out. And there was still nothing. And I would just continually hit these dead ends of I just needed to know. And so then my friend Peter King, who I worked with, and then who also worked with us on Mcmillions, he said, well, why don't you do a freedom of information request with the government? And I was like, oh, okay, I've never done that before, but I'll figure out how to do it. And threw that in. And then it took 3 years, a little over 3 years for that to go through. And then once that went through, I was able to then find out the FBI agents and federal prosecutor that were involved, and then reached out to them via LinkedIn, and they all said this is their favorite case that they've ever worked, and no one's ever contacted them about it. And that's when I looped Brian into the fold.
Being a kid of the 80s, 90s, like we grew up going to McDonald's. Like I remember playing the McDonald's Monopoly game. And I remember wanting to win the McDonald's Monopoly game, like all of us, right? Who wanted that chance of $1 million, by getting, a large fry or something. And to realize that you never had a chance to win one of the grand prizes because for over the course of a decade, people were essentially stealing the game pieces and claiming them, but there was a giant mystery behind how this fraud took place. It was just like this idea that no between 1989 and 2001, almost nobody won the McDonald's Monopoly high value prizes. And then to learn that the FBI went undercover as a film production crew, pretending to be a McDonald's commercial company to help catch who was behind this. It felt like this was one of those, how could this has never been done before? And the fact that it hadn't, and that these agents were saying this was my favorite case, but no one's ever reached out. It's like, well, okay, let's start the conversations. There was that element of, well, is there enough here? And so started filming with some of the agents, some of the federal prosecutor, talking to some of the quote unquote winners. And through that process, we started to realize, okay, there is, I mean, there's so much here. And obviously, like meeting Doug Matthews for the first time, it was evident that there were some good storytellers in the mix as well.
Mark Devereaux, this federal prosecutor, and Mark Devereaux is amazing, like as far as his personality and everything. But the way that he laid all this out to us, and then hearing the flip side of this from the McDonald's side, they don't know who's involved. They, as the federal prosecutor, FBI agents, this could be something that all the way at the top that they're doing as this large fraudulent thing. Somebody inside of McDonald's, somebody out, they had no idea who was involved with this whole thing. So the idea that they had to be so cloak and dagger about this and very coy was just really fascinating to us. So, we're imagining like you're, one of the key people in security at McDonald's. it's McDonald's, one of the biggest companies in the world, one of the most famous companies in the world. Just in the side, in the fact that like McDonald's is Americana at that point in time, you know. And so Mark Devereaux calling McDonald's saying, you and your highest level executives need to come down here to Jacksonville and we need to meet with you and we can't tell you anything else. And then of course, Rob Holm asking, when do you need this to happen? He's like, it should happen immediately. And then them having to fly down there, it's the head of security, it's their head of marketing, it's their head of legal, all these high level people on a flight to Florida to have no idea what they're there for. But obviously you're going into an FBI office, it's not going to be good. And that entire step-by-step process of Devereaux picking them up at the airport, immediately taking them to the FBI office, walking them through the office, and really slow playing everything because they needed to know if those people that were there were somehow connected to this. They're checking them if they're sweating, if their stories aren't lining up, if things seem out of the ordinary, and they're trickling out the information that they have when they're meeting with them in the room, just to kind of suss out if they have the culprit there. And then if not, they have to lay this entire thing out because they're going to have the ultimate ask. They want them to run the game, even though they know it's fraudulent.
To fully understand how the undercover works, you have to also understand who Doug Matthews is. So there are two agents on this, Rick Dent and Doug Matthews. Rick Dent is the senior agent. He's very logical, very conservative, a man of few words, as it's been described. And even when we had a chance to meet, which, we didn't film with him, but we had a great chat with him. And then Doug Matthews, of course. And if you haven't seen the documentary series, one of the things that we get all the time is that a real person? Like, was he a real agent? Like he's one of those, you would never suspect him to be an actual FBI agent. So he was a rookie agent, just really outgoing. He, self-proclaimed ADD, always chasing the shiny object. And he was driven by this idea of needing to go undercover. And he was pitching ideas left and right to Rick Dent and to some of the other agents. And everyone was kind of shooting him down until he came up with this idea of, well, when everybody actually wins, they sign that they're going to agree to participate in the promotion. So why don't we, reach out, publisher's clearance, like, house style, show up at their door with cameras, balloons, confetti, the whole 9 yards, and actually get them on tape telling us how they, won this game, how they won the McDonald's monopoly. And it was kind of crazy enough that Rick Dent said, okay, this could work, but who's going to do it? Who's going to be? And we always loved this line that Doug Matthews told us. He was like, well, I'll do it, and I'll be the director because, directors don't do shit. And, he was able to help get somebody from McDonald's. And this is where it just continues to get crazy. Someone from McDonald's inside went with him as a civilian, technically undercover, to pose as part of this film crew to legitimize it. And there was two different stages of operations. The one where the winner of the game that was actually happening, they go show up at his door, they do an undercover, but then they start trying to go after all the previous winners. And so they come up with this idea of hosting a reunion of winners event in Vegas. And in order to have everybody come out to the event, they're going to pay for it, of course, which was all BS. They wanted to go and film interviews with past winners to get them on tape to, put up on the big screen and make a whole thing. But the idea was just like to put the pressure, and also to cross-reference what they're actually saying right then and there with what they said when they originally won, but more importantly, to tickle the wire, because they were wiretapping a lot of different people throughout this process. And they thought, well, if we do an interview with someone on tape, as soon as we leave, like that's something that's going to trip them, like tickle the wire, so to speak, have like give them a reason to call whoever's behind this and say, hey, they just left my house. And in fact, that worked for a couple people. Well, the kickoff to this whole thing started with this post-it note, right? That on Rick Dent's desk that said McDonald's Monopoly Fraud. And this was like before anything was getting started. And one of the first things that Doug Matthews did was like, hey, what's that? And he starts looking into it, is he gets from this confidential informant, right? Somebody who calls this in, he gets a series of names saying that, these people are all related and they've all won the $1 million McDonald's Monopoly prize. And they're all getting these game pieces from this mysterious figure named Uncle Jerry. And so they had, this like name, Uncle Jerry. I mean, it sounds like someone who's in a mob. There's not a whole lot to it. And so they just start looking into it. But like, and that's who they're hoping to find on these wiretaps. And it wasn't until they start going through old phone records, cross-referencing of different winners, and they start to realize like, okay, there's a common number between a lot of these people, that are heavy like a month before they claim the prize, like during the prize, and then just fall off. And that one number happened to be a guy named Jerry Jacobson. And he was the head of security for Simon Marketing. And Simon Marketing was the outsourced company that McDonald's used to actually run the game. And so once they knew, okay, this is the guy, then they set out on a mission of, well, how is he doing it? Like they couldn't figure out how he's doing it, and yet they also wanted to catch him in the act. And so that was part of what made this mission such a fun, exciting thrill to experience.
The idea of the layout of this entire story was, after talking to everybody from the FBI and really digging into the story and talking to people who are on the winners slash criminal side, we looked at this whole thing, and there's the history lesson version of it where you just lay everything out in time order, and it's still interesting, but we were always really blown away by how the FBI works. And we all think like the FBI makes 2 phone calls and then somebody gets arrested, but the fact that this all started from one small question on a post-it note that expanded out to this massive investigation, we just thought was too interesting. We'd never seen anybody, any movie, any TV show that had really shown how the FBI actually works. So we thought, well, let's just never be ahead of the FBI. Let's learn everything at the pace that they're learning everything. And then that allows us to bounce around in time a little bit, but not in a confusing way. It will be really easy to track, because when they find out evidence of something, like, when they first find out like Michael Hoover's involved, they first find out like these family members are involved, but they don't realize like how deep it goes. And that's why in episode 2, then you start to learn like they learned really early. It was Jerry Jacobson was someone that was the most likely, is the biggest person of interest, was somebody who's most likely at least somehow involved with this. But then we start to branch back into that, and like we go back in time in episode 2, and when we start to get later in the book, because that's when the FBI figured it all out. So we really loved being on that ride with Doug Matthews, with Rick Dent, with Mark Devereaux, with Chris Graham and Tom Kinnear and Doug Estrada and Janet Pelliciotti, all of them. You have this entire office, and now we're like living it through their eyes. And then the thing with Jerry Jacobson is, it was, we reached out to him in every possible way you could think of, and there's been some contact. We'll just say that.
components of the story is how little time some of the people who were involved got. And you know, when you think about it, it's just like, okay, well, yeah, and he did this for a number of years, and he was getting a cut off of the top, right? So the essential scam, or the way that it worked, was he was able to steal the pieces, and we won't reveal how that happens, because you'll read it in the book, or if you watch the doc, you'll get a sense of that.
Or
But
listen to the audiobook, which is
listen to
narrated
the
by Brian and myself.
Yeah. He would get the high value game pieces, and he would sell them off. Or in a lot of cases, he had essentially middlemen, who recruiters, as they're referred to by the FBI and us in our book and doc, and they would find people to claim these pieces, essentially lie to McDonald's as to how they actually, got them. And there would be a kickback, that would happen to the recruiter. They would get a percentage, and then Jerry would get his cut. Uncle Jerry would get his cut. And so that was the way that it worked. And that's why this conspiracy, there were so many different people involved, and a lot of recruiters didn't know that there were other recruiters, so this web expanded out, you know, 53 people. I mean, we couldn't even talk to everyone in the doc or in the book. Some people have, since passed and whatnot. But it was one of the things that, and we can get into this, here in a bit, but there were so many people that were not criminals that were connected and tied to this. And I think that when you start to unpack, like, all right, well, there are good people that made bad decisions, or, really, if you, I mean, this is the thing James and I always say, to ourselves, is like, if you had a family friend or a family member come up to you and say, I have a surefire way for you to win $1 million, all you have to do is claim this game piece at McDonald's and just tell them that you peeled it off a little French fry box. Most people would have done that. Most people would do that, even to this day. And so it's easy to kind of put yourself in the shoes of some of these, federal criminals in a way. And we wanted to make sure that as you experience this and you understood, like, who they are, like, yes, they might not have gotten the amount of time that you would expect for a crime like this. I mean, a lot of people were like, they ruined my chance. They deserve, life sentences. But hopefully you feel for some of them as well, by the end, and you realize, like, okay, these were bad decisions that were made by, some, in many cases, decent people.
The book really gave us the opportunity to dive deeper into like the inner workings of what was happening, and almost like the inner monologue of essentially of what everybody was going through and the repercussions. I mean, with a documentary, we sit down and do interviews with everybody. And at a certain point, if we don't have the footage to support something, or in general, just you're still trying to keep people engaged in a visual medium. So, stopping down to hear more about, like, for example, Gloria Brown, like, she was a single mom. She was trying to make ends meet. And so we could tell a good chunk of her story. And obviously, like, her interview in the documentary is ultra powerful, but there was just more that she was dealing with, more that she was going through, more that was happening with her relationship with Robin, more of the fear that she was feeling from Jerry Colombo, who was really, in a sense, forcing her through all of this stuff. And so to be able to dive into that deeper, and then, really first and foremost, or the biggest piece of this, is the relationship between Doug Matthews and Rick Dent. Rick Dent didn't do a sit-down interview for the documentary, but we've had multiple, phone calls with him. We had two 3 hour long, separate 3 hour long sit-down sessions over breakfast and lunch, talking about all this, really going through the details of what it's like to, be in this world. And so to get what that relationship was like, and then to understand what it's like to be agents in an office which is supposed to be focusing on insurance fraud, and then knowing that these guys are just hell bent on helping people, And Jacksonville during that time was known as like a sleepy retirement office. You spent your last few years before you retired there. And Rick Dent and Doug Matthews took that as, it was like a vendetta for them. They needed to, close as many cases as possible because that's what they're there for. That's what the whole job is supposed to be. And so to really get to dig into that relationship more and understand, that they're definitely the odd couple. Rick Dent's a little bit country, and Doug Matthews definitely is rock and roll.